Welcome to Otherworld. Stories of the strange and supernatural. Today, we offer part 3 of Abaddon. As quickly as the accusing apparition had appeared, it vanished into the murky depths of the ocean, obscured by the tendrils of rockweed that clung to the seabed. Trapped by the undertow, Zane Crookshank's body screamed for oxygen. Every instinct cried out for him to take a breath. But down here, pinned beneath the crushing wall of water, he knew that if he surrendered to that urge, that breath would be his last. Then, just when he thought he was about to succumb, the current suddenly released him. Desperately kicking and thrashing, he at last broke through the waves and gulped the life-giving air. Zane looked for his board and saw that it had been carried off by the surf. He spotted it about 100 feet away, banging against one of the concrete blocks he had placed on the high tide line to prevent people from walking on the beach. He swam over to it and was annoyed to discover that the finish, smooth and flawless 2 minutes ago, was now deeply scratched. Worst of all, there was a starburst crack that obscured the tiny, offending word that he had spotted earlier. No matter how he tilted the board, it was impossible to see the letters because of the fractures in the clear finish above them. The fact that he was no longer able to view that devious insult didn't make it sting any less. But there was no point in calling his lawyer now. The proof that he would need in order to threaten the surfboard maker with litigation no longer existed. He would be denied justice. And that vexed him. But at least he was alive. Weak from the near-death experience, he staggered onto the shore, carrying his battered surfboard, and made for the house. He laid the board down in front of the porch, then climbed the stairs to the front door. The figurehead of the doomed ship Cassandra, which he had flippantly repainted so it appeared to be naked, seemed to glare at him disapprovingly.
"What the hell are you looking at?"
said Zane, gazing up at the figurehead as he passed beneath it.
"What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?"
He jabbed a finger at the silent female form.
"Yeah, that's right. You got nothing to say. 'Cause I'm the boss. And don't you forget it."
He made a note to himself to repaint the wooden maiden's face so that it presented a more welcoming expression. He entered the house and glanced at his cell phone, which he had left in the front vestibule. Zane saw that there had been 3 phone calls from his lawyer while he was out. That couldn't be good. Now that the adrenaline was wearing off, Zane began to feel unwell. His muscles and joints hurt from being hyperextended. His skin stung where it had been scraped across the barnacle-encrusted rocks. He felt a lump on the back of his head where the undertow had banged him against a submerged boulder. His ears were ringing from the pressure of having seawater driven up inside them. That was reason enough to delay dealing with the phone calls which he guessed had to do with the congressman's investigation and thus would be irritating and unpleasant. So instead, he peeled off his wetsuit and poured a generous shot of Jägermeister. Then he put his cell phone on silent mode and fell asleep on the living room sofa, listening to the sound of the surf and the annoying ringing in his ears. When he awakened, it was late afternoon. He felt groggy. The ringing in his ears was even louder now. But far more alarming than that was the sensation of hearing faint whispers. He bolted upright, prepared to confront any intruders. But his muscles were so sore now that the sudden motion caused him to gasp. He saw, too, that there were blood spots on the cushions from the cuts on his face. He eased himself up off the sofa, rose slowly to his feet, and, walking with effort, checked the house for the source of the voices. Methodically going from room to room, he discovered that all his audio devices, radio, television, stereo, and computer, were turned off. Zane wondered if he might be hearing someone outside on his property. He looked out the windows on every side of the house, but saw no one. Yet the unintelligible whispers continued. He was now worried that his injuries were worse than he had originally thought. He called his physician in New York, Dr. Bloom, and told him about the accident and his symptoms. "You need to get to an emergency room as quickly as possible," said Bloom. However, Zane didn't want to go to the hospital in Halifax. He figured that anything that was government-run and free to anyone who needed it couldn't be any good, including the entire Canadian healthcare system. So after extracting a promise from Dr. Bloom to personally examine him that night, he caught the last flight to New York. By midnight, his concussion tests and MRI scan in the neuro ICU at New York Presbyterian were complete. The good news is there's no sign of any bleeding in the brain or any lesions that could affect neurological function, said Dr. Bloom.
What's the bad news?
Bloom hesitated a moment.
Well, seeing apparitions and hearing voices is never a good thing. Now, in all likelihood, the ghostly face you saw when you were caught in the undertow was a hallucination brought on by a lack of oxygen. And hearing whispers, well, that's a rare but occasional symptom of tinnitus. But we need to be certain that these aren't manifestations of something more serious. So I'm keeping you here overnight for observation, just to make sure. You've been through a lot today, Zane, so I'll give you a sedative to help you get some sleep.
However, despite the sedative and a comfortable private room, Zane's slumbers that night were troubled. He had one disturbing dream after another. He awakened once to use the bathroom and left the lights off in the hope that it would be easier to get back to sleep afterward. But as he washed his hands, he looked up into the darkened mirror above the sink and was startled to see the reflection of a pallid face. The same deathly face he had seen when he was caught in the undertow, staring at him with lifeless black eyes. He spun around in the dark, but there was nothing behind him. And when he turned back toward the mirror, the specter had disappeared. His heart pounded, and he fought to catch his breath. Zane chalked it up to a trick of the shadows and the fright of his near-death experience. When he was finally able to get back to sleep, Zane had the most disturbing dream of all. In it, he was floating in the ocean in front of Abaddon. It was so foggy, he could barely see the outline of his house. He noticed it gradually growing distant and was alarmed to realize he was being carried out to sea. In the mist, he heard the voices again. But they were louder this time and seemed to be whispering his name. Shadows moved in the fog around him, and a couple of times he saw grimacing, washed-out faces staring at him with the same black, lifeless eyes. He felt something bump against his leg, but couldn't see into the water to make out what it was. A moment later, he felt bony hands gripping his ankles. Then he was pulled downward into the depths, unable to breathe as he sank helplessly into the crushing blackness. We hope you have enjoyed part 3 of Abaddon. Watch for the next installment. And remember, if you find yourself in a place that seems familiar, yet strangely disquieting, you may have just become the next visitor to Otherworld. Until then.